Okay, for this video I wanted to talk about the IRS Form 8839, which is used to include with your Form 1040 if you have any qualified adoption expenses during the year or prior years. So why is this important? Well, the federal government gives you a tax break. They allow you to take a tax credit if you adopt a child. And this child can be from the United States, or it could be a foreign adoption as well. So I'm going to go through the form here, but first I want to cover a slide I've got with just some background information and what costs are eligible to be deducted, or rather taken as a tax credit. Okay, so the Form 8839, again, this is used to report qualified adoption expenses. Now, the average cost of adopting a child is incredibly expensive, right? In the U.S., the figures I've seen are approximately $70,000. That's all in for attorney's fees, adoption agency fees, court costs. So it's quite expensive. Even if you go abroad, adopt a child from a foreign country, you're still looking to pay 20 to 40 grand in adoption related fees and expenses, right? So again, the federal government gives you a little bit of a tax break here. You're allowed to take a tax credit for a certain portion of the cost, right? So now the maximum credit is $14,440 for 2021. The amount is adjusted every couple of years, typically for inflation. But you know, it's certainly a good tax credit to be able to take. But obviously, it comes nowhere near the actual amount of expenses you're going to incur, right? So if you have $70,000 in adoption expenses because you adopted a child within the U.S., the maximum credit you're going to be able to get is $14,440. So it's still something, right? It's helpful, helps reduce your taxes, but obviously not enough to cover the total cost. Now, the tax credit should be claimed in the year the adoption was finalized. So for example, if you started the adoption process in 2020 and you had some expenses, or you got lawyers, went to court, paid some fees, adoption agent fees, but the adoption wasn't finalized until 2021, then you want to be claiming the adoption expenses in 2021. So when was the adoption finalized? Now, there's actually different standards for whether this is a domestic or a foreign adoption. So this sentence you see here, this is typically the standard when you are adopting a foreign child, and so that's what we're going to use in our example. If you have a domestic adoption, then you can be taking the credit in the year, well, you can be claiming the expenses and taking credit in the year that you're incurring the payments, right? So when are you paying for these expenses? You don't have to wait until the adoption is finalized. Now, the IRS Form 8839 has a very good chart in the instructions to cover this issue. So if we go to the 2021 instructions for the 8839, if you scroll down here, so it's on page 3, this is where they cover the timing of the deduction. So you have a table here for domestic adoptions, and then a table here for foreign adoptions. So there are different standards on when you can take the credit or claim an exclusion if your employer is paying for it, depending on whether it's domestic or foreign, and in what year are you incurring the expenses, what year is the adoption finalized. So before you start to take the credit or complete this form, I recommend consulting these charts here because they will give you more guidance as to when you can claim these credits, okay? Okay. So now, what are the qualified adoption expenses? Well, it's some of the obvious stuff, right? So adoption agency fees, you have to get an attorney. There's going to be a lot of court costs, both foreign or domestic. You've got to go to a court generally to legitimize the adoption. If you have to travel to meet the child, the parent, the birth parent, or travel to the agency that has the child, then you can deduct those travel and meal expenses. And then re-adoption expenses are also deductible as well. So what's a re-adoption? Well, if you're adopting a child from abroad, the federal government will generally recognize the adoption at the federal level, but some states will not recognize it necessarily, and so you have to adopt a child abroad, and then you have to come back to the United States, and whatever state you're living in, you have to, in effect, re-adopt the child at the state level. So re-adoption expenses, if the child's not from the U.S., might be applicable here. Now, the adoption credit is non-refundable, so what that means, like a lot of other non-refundable credits, the amount that you can take as a credit is limited to whatever your tax liability is. So you can reduce your tax liability down to zero, but if you have credits that go beyond that, you're not going to get a refund check from the IRS. Okay, so let's look at the 8839 here. It's a relatively straightforward form, right? So we have the taxpayer up here, John Q. taxpayer, the taxpayer's social security number, and then the child's name. So we have John Child here, date of birth, and then check whatever applicable boxes are here. In this case, we do have a foreign child. So John taxpayer, he went abroad to adopt a child, and so the child was born in 2020. He did apply for a social security number for the child, so you can enter that there if it's applicable. And then in column G, check if adoption became final in 2021 or earlier. In our case, yes, right? So the child was born in 2020, but John did all of this during 2021, and the adoption was finalized in 2021, so we can check that box there. Now, when we get into the adoption credit computation, so as you can see here, line 2 has the max credit, right? So maximum credit, again, is going to be $14,440. And then it's asking us here, did you file in prior years for the same child? And that goes back to the issue about if you have a domestic adoption, you can be claiming expenses in the years where the adoption is not finalized, right? So if this was a domestic adoption and John maybe had some expenses in 2020, claimed them, now 2021, the adoption's finalized, he has more costs, that's where this question would come into and apply. Now, line 5, qualified adoption expenses. In John's case, he spent $21,600. So again, remember, consult the list. What is the qualified adoption expense? Generally, it's those attorney's costs, court fees, travel expenses. Not everything is deductible. You know, they do make a point of saying if you made payments that would otherwise be illegal under federal or state law, you can't deduct them. So what are they getting at there? Well, if you go abroad or even domestically to adopt a child and it's not through the proper channels, you just pay somebody, that is arguably an illegal payment, and so you're not going to be able to deduct those costs, right? Those so-called grease payments. So be very, very careful, follow all the proper protocols, do everything legitimately, and you can deduct all those expenses. Now, there is a MAGI limitation, so MAGI being modified adjusted gross income. As you note here, the threshold for the 2021 year is $216,660, right? So if you have a taxpayer that earns more than that, then the credit's phased out. In John's case here, he's well below that threshold, so he is eligible to take the full credit. Now, the amount of the credit from the limitation worksheet, again, remember, this is a non-refundable credit. So you are not going to be able to deduct or take a credit for an amount that exceeds your tax liability. So right now we're computing $12,106, and if we go back to John's tax return here up to the top 2 pages, we can see that he's got some income, so he's got some wages up here, investment income, some other income, and his taxable liability is, taxable income is $76,622, and then the amount of tax that's being computed is $12,606, and then he gets a credit of $500 from the child tax credit, right? The 8812 form. So his net tax liability after that piece is $12,106, and so that's why our adoption credit is limited to $12,106, because again, we cannot take an adoption tax credit that's non-refundable in excess of our liability. So this is going to be the cap for the year for John, and so he's going to get a full refund of all of his federal withholding and other various credits. But again, I mean, the adoption tax credit, certainly very beneficial, but of course, you know, as we noted on the first slide, not enough to cover all the costs, but certainly a big help to taxpayers that did decide to adopt a child either locally or abroad. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment below, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next video. Thank you.